Now Asya and I will present some of the research that Peter was discussing earlier on. And as Peter mentioned, one of the main goals of the CrossMigration project has been to map the field of migration studies. And so what we did in this research that we're presenting was we took Web of Science data, which is the main source of the Migration Research Hub that Fiona's just been presenting, in order to analyze the way in which the field of migration studies has institutionalized, or in terms of this conference, come of age in recent decades. So we know that the field has grown significantly, as Peter was showing earlier, but our question was concerned rather with how that growth has taken shape. And so we look at institutionalization with a threefold approach. Firstly, we analyze self-referentiality, or in other words, the extent to which migration research refers to other migration research. Secondly, we look at the aspect of internationalization in the field, or the number of countries in which migration research is conducted, and the extent to which researchers in those countries collaborate across borders. And thirdly, we look at the formation of epistemic communities, or sub-areas within the field of migration studies that cluster around certain themes, approaches, or disciplines.
We employed an iterative research design, going back and forth between theory and data. And we have interviewed experts, long-standing researchers in the field of migration, and we asked them about their perceptions of how the field has developed, how its conceptual, disciplinary, and international development took place. And on the other hand, we gathered the data and we analyzed, we did a bibliometric analysis of this data. And the insights from the interviews, on the one hand, contributed to a theoretical framework, and on the other hand, they helped us interpret and discuss citation and collaboration networks that we built using the bibliometric analysis.
So in the first aspect of our threefold approach, we looked at self-referentiality, as I mentioned. And what we found is that over the recent decades, the density of citation connections between journals in which migration research is published actually continually increased until around 2008. So in other words, even though the number of sources was gradually increasing, the field did not fragment, so to speak. However, what we found in the last decade or so is that density of citation connections has decreased somewhat. Now, this may be due to several reasons, and we suggest that it could be down to a significant increase in the number of sources, as Peter showed earlier, in which migration research is published. Or it may also be down to the fact that migration research has moved from migration studies, so to speak, particularly in the last 5 years or so, back towards mainstream disciplines. Or in other words, there's an indication that perhaps in the last few years, mainstreaming has taken place in migration studies. Then, in terms of internationalization, what we found is that the field has indeed internationalized over the past 2 decades or so. If you compare this map, which shows international co-authorship links in migration studies in the year 1998, you can see that there were a handful of countries in which English language migration research was published, and there were some connections between those countries. So the size of each node denotes how many international co-authorships there were, and the thickness of each line denotes how many international co-authorships there were between the two countries at either end. And we say that the field did significantly internationalize in the last 20 years or so. As you can see here, compare this to the 1998 map. This is the international co-authorships in 2018. We can see that the number of countries in which migration research takes place has significantly increased, as well as the number of international co-authorships, as the map shows. However, we do argue that this internationalization has been uneven to a certain extent, with the continued dominance of North American and European scholarship in English language migration research. possibly down to the fact that many of the bigger journals in which migration research appears are based in these continents. Although North American and European research accounts for numerically most of the international co-authorships in migration studies, what we did find is that scholars in Asia and in South America and in Africa have a higher tendency to collaborate across borders.
On this slide, you can see the development of migration studies over 40 years period of time. It's presented over 5-year periods. What we're looking here at is the reference basis of migration studies and how it developed over time. Basically, the authors that are cited together in the same papers form clusters, and we can see that in the earlier years of migration studies, these clusters have been scattered. So there were several conversations going on separately from each other, and these clusters had a very strong disciplinary basis from sociology to demography to economic sociology. And then here, for example, we can see the emergence of social psychology, which gradually merged into something bigger, something more joined, something more interconnected. Possibly, we observe here the interdisciplinary osmosis, and we could argue that the field of migration studies became interdisciplinary or maybe post-disciplinary. Let me introduce this more in detail. So here we see the map of the late 70s, early 80s, and it's clear that there are several separate conversations going on between demographers and between the sociologists that study ethnic and racial assimilation of migrants in the receiving context. Then there are refugee studies and economists, also quite separate from each other. And everything that unites them is just the common source of data, United States Bureau, Census Bureau. And that's also an indicator of a heavy presence of US literature in that period of time. Now, when we look at the later decade of 2005-2014, the picture is completely different. And the clusters are still there, but they no longer bear only disciplinary basis. They shifted towards clustering around certain thematic angles. So, for example, Michigan-Wisconsin School is a group of interdisciplinary researchers that are preoccupied with the questions of integration in the receiving context, while a global systems school is more interested in to look at migration through the lens of transnationalism. Of course, the disciplinary boundaries haven't completely disappeared, and for example, we can see that in acculturationist cluster, there is a more presence of social psychologists and psychology. Overall, there is more and more literature that brings together researchers and authors that write in different aspects, and this is indicated by a round shape of this network. So it means that there is more research that cites very diverse authors in one reference list.
So to bring our research together, we provide 4 sort of takeaway messages from this research. We argue that by the mid-2000s, migration studies as a research field had indeed come of age, as shown in the graphs that Asya was just showing with the interdisciplinary osmosis that she mentioned. And so the field has moved from a clear set of disparate disciplinary communities towards interlinked post-disciplinary thematic angles. However, that is in recent years, there are indications that migration studies indeed is moving back towards the mainstream disciplines. Finally, our final finding is that the field of migration studies has indeed internationalized in recent decades, but that internationalization has taken on an uneven character with the continued dominance of North American and European scholarship in particular.
Of course, in our presentation or in our paper, we could cover all topics that could potentially be explored in this wealth of data. We suggest that the future research needs to take a closer look in the contributions that have been done by sociology, anthropology, history, and geography to the field of migration studies, and how these disciplines have, in which way they contributed to the field. And probably this is a good moment to stop right now and move on to the roundtable, where we can discuss together with our participants the past, present, and future of migration research. Jürgen, the floor is yours.